I'm really excited to be here and speaking with one of my favorite poets, Shikha Malaviya, about this fantastic new book about a phenomenal, very powerful woman ahead of her times and who managed to, retain her power or rather steal some power back from the patriarchy. Um, Shikha, first I want to ask you about how you came upon the idea or the desire to write a poem in this, like a book in this format, one telling the story of a woman, the journey of her life in verse. And how did you meet Anandibai Joshee?
Thanks. That's a wonderful question, Prerna. So I was actually, a little bit about myself. I was born in England. I grew up in the United States and partially in India. So although I identify as Indian, I also have to acknowledge the fact that I've lived in the US and I have US citizenship and stuff. So, they call it South Asian history, but the truth is that when you live in a country that's not your motherland, often the narrative of where you come from begins with my parents came, so that's why I'm here. So when I was a child, I went through a lot of racism, and often one of the things I would hear was, go back to where you came from. And that got me thinking, and I kept on thinking about that question. I thought about it through my first collection of poetry, Geography of Tongues, and I was like, who am I? What are my roots? There must have been others like me who came to the United States, but before me. So I was in search of that, and so I did a search on who was the first Indian woman to come to the United States. And then that's how I chanced upon this photograph, which was just like a riveting photograph, and I urge you all to search for it. It's a picture of Anandibai Joshee, who in, I believe it's 1884 or 85, was in medical school, and she's with two other doctors. She's seated, and then there's a Japanese doctor in a kimono, and then there's a Syrian doctor who's wearing her Syrian dress and a headdress of coins, and Anandibai is in a sari, and she's just looking straight at you, almost like Mona Lisa. I swear her eyes will follow you, no matter which direction you're in and you see the photograph in. So I saw that photograph and I was riveted. And I was like, who is this woman? I want to know more about her. And so then I started digging and digging and digging, and I went through this, down this rabbit hole of research. And that's when I was just shocked that why don't we know who she is? I mean, people in Maharashtra do know of her, but other than that, nobody whom I asked among my friends and family, except for my sister-in-law who's from Maharashtra, she was the only one who knew who Anandibai Joshee was. And this is the first Indian woman, the first Indian female medical doctor, and the first Indian woman to study in the United States in 1883. I never knew that, such a person existed. So I wanted to write about her, and I couldn't figure out how to write about her. But since I'm a poet, I thought maybe I could try and attempt to write her life through poetry. And while it was very daunting, I finally bit the bullet and did it, and somehow, I was able to write this book. Yeah.
And I remember we discussed this earlier when we were editing this as well. This book has also been quite a journey for you as well. Like you're talking about this woman, the difficulties and the parallels that you see between her life then and yours today. And which was the most challenging poem, the hardest one to write in terms of being, emotionally prepared to go to those sort of depths? Because it is a very moving collection, because she was really successful, but she also had a very difficult, very tragic life. It wasn't a long life. She lost a child. Her marriage was difficult. There's a lot of grays to the characters involved there. So which poem do you think was the highlight for you that really was very emotionally demanding and needed you to sort of balance your craft with what you felt towards the subject?
Wow, that's another wonderful question. I believe it or not, I wrote a poem on that photograph that I'd first described, and that was the most difficult thing to write about because, see, Anandibai, when she was born, she was married at the age of 9 to a man who was 16 years older, and she was always at the mercies and whims of either what her parents and her mother expected, what women expected her roles should be, and then also her husband, who really encouraged her to study, but he was very mercurial. He would often beat her, you know, if she didn't study, and she was a child at the time, right? So the only time that I feel, not the only time, but the time where she came into her own was when she came to the United States without her family, without her husband, all alone, and lived with an American family. She had to, you know, hold her own, and that's when she came into her own and she became herself, apart from any other influence, you know, in a way. So that picture, that very picture exudes that. And so I wrote that poem. God knows how many times. I wanted to write it in her voice, but then it was long and rambling. Then I thought maybe I should have the other two doctors in there, and I said, no, this is all about her. So it was very challenging for me because I was writing in the voice of Anandibai, right? And, you know, that's a very scary responsibility, and that's a risk, right, that I took. But I wanted to convey the power in that photograph to say, yes, I'm here. I know who I am. And then that was actually the 1880s. America was at the height of Orientalism. So they were exoticizing her over there. But here she was trying to be who she was, right? So that poem was the most difficult for me. It's a very simple poem, but it was the hardest. Yeah.
Before we get on to our next questions, could you read that poem?
Yes, I'd love to. 1 second. Sorry, I didn't mark it. One second, sorry. I found it. Sorry about the wait. So the title is quite self-explanatory. When they ask us to pose for a photograph at the Women's Medical College reception, Philadelphia, 1885. Forgive us if we don't smile, the ocean's scent still on our clothes, the stench of sea. We, visitors of another clime, of warmer lands are we. With pride we wear our native clothes, silks and jewels we proudly don, sari, kimono, headdress of coins, with lyre, sash, a handheld fan, no scalpel, stethoscope, or degree. 3 female doctors of foreign pedigree playing dress-up for Western eyes. In our appearance, they see worlds wild. Forgive us if we don't smile.
It was beautiful. So I have 2 questions in
Yes.
one. Since you wrote a Geography of Tongues, how has your process, your writing process, how you bring your thoughts together, how you revise, how you edit, how has that changed? And has this book given you an opportunity to experiment with form and style as well? And I've seen a few different ones and different poems, and it just looks lovely on the page. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. So my first book is called Geography of Tongues, and that came out in 2014. And that book was very autobiographical, and it was about, what it's like to be an immigrant, and it was about identity and culture and family. But this book was not about me, although it was a journey about me learning more about myself through Anandibai. But because this book was about somebody else's life, in many ways, it was very, very liberating to not have to write about oneself or think about oneself, but to dive into another life. And it really taught me more about something I really believe in is, making the personal universal and also making the universal personal. So that, I think that I really grew from writing this book in that way. And to see that, there are so many women's narratives out there that are buried that, we can bring out in alternative ways. So this is, very much a biography and a history as well as poetry. And so I've always loved mixing genres. I've never believed in trying to box literature into a certain genre. So this book was all about play, in many ways as well. And so when you mentioned forms, I didn't set out to write in different forms, but then when you think about when someone leads a life, and Anandibai led a short life, she died shortly before she was 22. There's different stages in our life and we behave in different ways. And, if you write in one way, that becomes static after a while, and nobody's life is static. And so that's why naturally this desire to experiment and play with different forms came into being. So I have ghazals in here, I have pantoum in here, I've written in couplets here, I've done contrapuntal poems, and there's a poem where you can read it from top to bottom and from bottom to top. And so of course I was inspired by other poets, especially black poets in America. They've written a lot of their history in poetry form. And so that really informed my aesthetic in this book. And so I was really thrilled that I could combine that, and hopefully I've produced a book that is powerful in conveying Anandibai's incredible but short life.
I definitely think you have. And I would like you to read some of your favorite poems from this collection.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you.
Contrapuntal one, please.
You want the contrapuntal one? Okay.
If requests are.
Contrapuntal one, and I will definitely read that. But first, I'm going to start with, so when she was born, Anandibai Joshee was named Yamuna Ganpatrao Joshee. And she was named Yamuna because she was born on Yamuna Jayanti, which is the celebration of the river and goddess Yamuna. So this poem is called Naming or Namkaran. Is it really true that being named after a river is bad luck, a turbulent life? Are all women rivers then? And tell me the story again of how I came to be a paisley in your belly. Why you named me daughter of the blinding sun, sister of the Lord of death, tumbling down to earth to meet her blue beloved. How I was born the same day as a goddess riverine, whose holy drops the priest sprinkled on my forehead 11 days after my birth, introducing me to this world, whispering into my ear, Yamuna, 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 a contract signed in water, a girl's fate sealed. So I want to read one more poem before I get to the contrapuntal poem. And this is sort of about her childhood, right? How, she came from a time where women's roles were, very traditional, bound to the home. In fact, women didn't even wear shoes because they didn't need to because they never left the house. So this is a poem called To Touch the Sky, 1873. The sun's shadow swept over my face as I built biceps, drawing water from the well, rope burns on my hands and wrists, and when I complained there was no time to play, Ai's anger drew welts on my back, her orders a daily refrain. Gather sticks from the chulha, scrub the pakshala. So when I found the zopara empty, I grabbed its chains as if a horse's reins, pumping my legs furiously to see how high I could go. braids flying, skirt rippling, sun winking, toes trying to reach the sky, touch the sky. My only witness, a green pigeon, whose wings I conspired to steal. So here's the contrapuntal poem. It's called Things I Wish I Had Told Her. I as in her mother. She had told me. Think of it as a transaction. Milk flowing from the breast in a spray, not a trickle. Hunger, milk, mouth, nipple. Heavy like sacks of guineas. Currency of motherhood, even when there's no infant to suckle. Milk leaking every 2 hours, womb shivering after the fact, keeping time with phantom feeds, an empty cradle rocked by sea breeze. And this is the first version, and that was top to bottom. Now I'll read it bottom to top. And this was about her miscarriage. So, an empty cradle rocked by sea breeze, keeping time with phantom feeds, womb shivering after the fact, milk leaking every 2 hours, even when there's no infant to suckle. Currency of motherhood, heavy like sacks of guineas. Hunger, milk, mouth, nipple. Milk flowing from the breast in a spray, not a trickle. Think of it as a transaction.
I'd like to invite questions for the poet, if anyone.
Yes, Jerry.
Not a question so much as a comment. I wanted to say that your contrapuntal poem achieves two things simultaneously. One is it has a great measure of control over the form, but it does not sacrifice the meaning or the beauty of what you're saying for the form, and I think that was wonderful. So if you could share a little about the process of writing it, we would all learn.
Oh boy. The person whom I was inspired by to write contrapuntal poems is Anandibai Joshee, who's an American poet, a Black American poet, and he wrote a phenomenal book called Olio. And Olio was a book about Black performers who weren't recorded. So he wanted to write about their lives. And so he had poems where there were these twins that performed, and they were conjoined twins. And so the poems he had were almost like the shape of a butterfly. There were two distinct voices of the twins, and then the poems would conjoin each other and then separate. And those poems, you could read from top to bottom, right to left, left to right, up, down, down, up. And I don't have that kind of mastery, but it really inspired me to think about, there were two conversations there in this poem that I wrote, that one that Anandibai wanted to have with her mother, and one which she wished her mother had had with her. Because in those days, they didn't really communicate about sex, they didn't communicate about women's bodies, what happens to your bodies, what happens when there's loss, So I wanted to somehow capture that, and I thought the contrapuntal form would be really good because both those voices could be enmeshed in there. And it was very difficult because you have to make sure that each sentence, can stand on its own. So that is what I tried to do. I wrote each line alternating each other, but I didn't want to put it in two columns. So I tried to enmesh them as well. But that was basically my process. That's how I did it. But it did take a lot of time to craft the sentences to make sure that each sentence could stand on its own and then be a whole together. And I've also done that so when Anandibai went to the United States, her husband couldn't afford to go with her, so they wrote letters to each other. So I also have written their letters to one another in the same form as well. Yeah.
Anyone else? Any questions? All right, I guess. One last poem before we...
Sure, I'd love to share. So this is something that really blew my mind. When Anandibai came to the United States, she brought, dal, chawal, she brought rice and pulses and all of her ingredients with her. And the host family she was staying with, whom she, thought of as her aunt or maushi, she invited, of course, her maushi and uncle was there, but all of their friends. And Anandibai, imagine, this is in 1883. She held a feast where she cooked Indian food, or Marathi food, rather Maharashtrian food, and she drew an alpana on the floor. She had all of these white American people sit on the floor. She gave her saris for the American women to wear, along with her jewelry and bindis, and she had them eating with their hands the way Indians do. So, yeah, exactly. Power to her. She was an amazing woman. So I wrote a poem on that in ghazal form, and it's called When the Guests Sup as Gods, a ghazal. So, Roselle, New Jersey, 1883. In my wildest dreams, never do I fathom tonight that I should turn them into feasting Indians tonight. Not those whose vast plains they call their own, but proud Marathas from my faraway native tonight. All the fair ladies draped in woven bordered saris, hands bangled, necks spangled, shining bright tonight, as they swish around the inlaid floor like princesses, in my colorful trousseau that belongs to them tonight. 18 squares hand-drawn in red and white powder, on the dining room floor where guests sup as gods tonight, set with plates stitched from broad buttonwood leaves. A rich meal of spiced vegetables and fruit await all tonight. After a Sanskrit prayer blessing this feast is chanted, all eyes look up to me on how to proceed tonight. No spoons, no forks, nor knives, just their pale, bare hands, sampling 18 exotic dishes prepared by myself tonight. There's still some more. Fashioning small balls out of their food with pink fingertips, they pop them into their mouths like all of India does tonight. The meal ends with a serenade and sprinkling of rose water, bouquets of freshly plucked flowers given to each guest tonight. Oh, Anandi, see the red kunku on all their white foreheads, how the love of my new sisters makes this heart swell tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shikha.